What's up, interview hackers? Sam here from Byte.com, and in this video I want to address a problem or a question that I've been getting so frequently recently, which is basically, is it even worth applying to companies right now if companies aren't hiring? And so what I really want to do here is I want to address that question, but I also want to give you 4 specific steps that you can take as you're going through your job application process, given the current economic climate, given everything that's going on right now, the things that you should be thinking about. So first of all, just right off the bat, to answer the question, yes, it is worth continuing to apply to jobs. It's worth continuing your career search and to improve your career while some companies are not hiring. And so I want to give you 4 steps that we can actually follow to go through that process. So step number 1 is really important, and we talked about this on Monday, and that's this idea of making sure that the story that you are telling yourself about what's going on is correct and looking at things objectively. Because so often we tend to catastrophize what's going on around us, and we say things to ourselves like, oh, no one is hiring right now. And if you take that approach, if you think about things that way, it's going to affect your ability to actually go out there and apply for jobs, because you're going to be going into this with this super defeatist mindset, right? And so it's really important just straight off the bat that you acknowledge that that is not true. There are absolutely companies that are not hiring right now, but based on some of the research that I've seen, at least 65% of companies are actually still actively hiring right now. So while of course that's not everyone, that is a large percentage of the total companies out there that are still hiring. So it's important, step number 1, to look objectively at the way things are. And as things change, this is something that you want to continue to do, because things are going to change over the next year. We have to be prepared for that bit of uncertainty. But the key is just looking at things objectively and understanding things the way that they are, and not the way that we are like afraid of, or the way that we sort of hyperbolize and feel that things are. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is to make sure that you're actually using the resources that are available to you. So as you're going out and applying for jobs, don't go and do exactly what you would have done before. Because what you might do is, let's say that you just went and you submitted applications to all the same companies that you were going to submit applications to before. There's a real possibility that some of those companies are no longer hiring right now. And so you're completely wasting your time by applying to companies that have instituted a complete hiring freeze. It's just not worth doing. And so you're taking those resources, you're taking the time and energy that you could put towards customizing your resume or customizing your cover letter towards companies that are actually hiring and that could give you a job offer. You're taking that energy away from that and you're applying it in places where it'll be completely wasted. So a great resource for this that I think most people have seen is Candor.co has a list of companies that are actually hiring right now versus companies with hiring freezes. And if you just Google Candor hiring freezes, it's the first link that you'll see in Google. And that will allow you to say, okay, well, of the companies that I'm applying for, which of these companies is actually still hiring? So that's number 1. Number 2 with this, in terms of using the resources that you have, is talking to your friends and colleagues, talking to people that you know, learning from people. Are there jobs? Is a company saying that they're instituting a hiring freeze, but maybe they're still looking for a particular role? That's something that's possible, and maybe you're a good fit for that. Do you have a friend who could refer you at a company? There are lots of resources out there, and make sure that you're capitalizing on those resources. But at the same time, a sort of part B to this step is that I also want you to be prepared that you may need to make some sacrifices. So let's say, for example, you have one dream company, and that company instituted a hiring freeze. Now, you could just sort of bemoan your loss and say, oh, well, that just sucks because now I can't ever land a job because that one company is not hiring. Or you can say, okay, well, for now, I'm going to have to put that on the back burner, and I might have to look at companies that are not quite as perfectly matched to what I want to do, or I might need to wait to apply to that job. So be prepared to make some small sacrifices, but sacrifices is different than saying, I'm just not going to apply for jobs. I'm just going to settle for what I'm doing now because no one is hiring. So that's an important distinction to make, that you can focus on, that you can be prepared to make those small sacrifices without having to sacrifice everything. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 is that you need to, more than ever, figure out ways that you can stand out through the job application and interview process. Because if you think about it, the fact that some companies are not hiring means that there was a shift of there being less supply of jobs and more demand for each of those jobs, right? Because the same number of people are probably applying to jobs, and there are fewer actual jobs for them to apply to. So it's more important than ever that you be able to stand out when you are going through that process. And one of the biggest things that you can do, one of the best ways that you can do this, is to think about, how can I go above and beyond? How can I put more effort in and get a disproportionate result for my effort? This is something that, it's this idea of, if you've ever heard that story about like Abraham Lincoln, where if he had 6 hours to cut down a tree, he'd spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe. That's exactly what you're doing here. You're focusing on sharpening the axe by saying, like, rather than just spam out my application to everyone, I'm going to focus on customizing my resume specifically to that company. I'm going to customize my cover letter. I'm going to do some research on that company and say, okay, well, I know that they're looking for this kind of role. I know that they're looking for these particular things. How can I address those directly? How can I really stand out to them? And so this takes a lot more work, but you're going to see disproportionate results. Like, if you think about it, you could either send out a generic resume to 100 companies, or you could send out customized resumes to 10 companies. Takes about the same amount of time. You're going to get a very low hit rate if you just blast out your resume. Whereas you could get a very high hit rate if you send out those customized resumes. So like, maybe if you see a 1% or 5% response rate from sending out 100 resumes versus a 50% response rate from sending out really customized resumes, then you're going to see the same number of companies getting back to you in both cases. But in the case of sending those really customized ones, you know that they're very like excited about you, and you know that that's a good fit, versus like having 5 offers that are just kind of, like, I don't even know if that company is really interested in me at all. So by taking that approach, it makes a huge, huge difference. And that's really important. And then also thinking about, once you're getting in the front door, being prepared for those interviews. And I know we talk about the interviews a lot, and I'm not going to talk about that here, but if you haven't joined us for our masterclass, we do have a masterclass called The 4 Horsemen of the Whiteboarding Apocalypse, where I talk through the actual approach that you can take to prepare for these coding interviews. And you can find that at bytebybyte.com/masterclass. So I'd highly encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. So step number 1 was to stop catastrophizing and look at things objectively and understand the situation as time is going on. Step 2, use the resources that you have available. Step 3, find ways to stand out as you're going through the process. And now the final step, step 4, is to dig your well before you're thirsty. And here's the idea. Most of the time, we're just going along in our life. We're going along, we're doing things the way that we always do them, and then something happens. Maybe we lose our job. Maybe, we all of a sudden, our boss gets fired and we hate our new manager. Maybe our significant other is moving to a new city, and now all of a sudden it's like urgent. Right now, all of a sudden, we went from 0 to 60 in terms of our needing to find a job. And the problem is that we don't spend the time prior to that actually building the connections, actually building our skills, actually focusing on the things that we would need to do, so that when we inevitably end up in that situation, because it's going to happen one way or another at some point in our career, when we inevitably end up in that situation, we're completely unprepared. And the idea of digging a well before you're thirsty, if you're thirsty, it's going to take you a really long time to dig a well to actually find water. So you may die of thirst before you're actually able to find water. And so how can you do this in your career? There are a couple different things that I'd encourage you to think about as you're trying to build these relationships, as you're trying to maintain this ability to find a job sort of at the drop of a hat. So number 1, maintain your relationships. This is sort of an obvious one, but it's so important because so often, like, we've all received that email where someone reaches out to us on Facebook or on, like, they text us and they're like, hey, and you're like, that they're about to ask you for something, right? Because it's someone who hasn't contacted you in the last 2 years, and you're like, they send you this vague message and you're like, okay, get to the point. Like, what is it that you're asking of me? And we hate that, right? Because it feels so transactional. So how can you build these relationships and maintain these relationships before it gets to the point of having to ask for something? How can you reach out to someone? Could you reach out to someone to just say, hey, how's it going? Just wanted to see how, I saw on LinkedIn that you're working at this company. How's that going? And don't ask them for anything. Just start a conversation. And then over time, if you are maintaining that conversation and that connection, if you then go and you're like, hey, by the way, I'm looking at new job opportunities. Is there anything at your company that you think might be a good fit for me, or something like that? then all of a sudden it doesn't feel transactional because you didn't go into it with a pure purpose of making a transaction. So if you can maintain those relationships, that's really huge. Second, reply to recruiters when they reach out to you. Maintain those relationships with the recruiters, and even if you're not interested in a job right now, say like, hey, I'm not looking for something right now, but would love to stay in touch. That's another great way to maintain relationships. And I can tell you, like, for me personally, if I wanted to go find a job, I could have 5 interviews lined up by tomorrow because I have those relationships. I would just have to email a couple people and immediately schedule interviews. And that's the difference between maintaining those relationships and letting them just kind of fade away. Next, keeping your LinkedIn profile up to date, super valuable, keeping your resume up to date, all these things so that when you do get into that point of interviewing for the jobs, you're ready to go, your LinkedIn profile is up there, asking people for references on your LinkedIn, all that stuff kind of table stakes a little bit here. But if you can keep doing that as you have your job, it's something that we don't usually think about, but if you can keep doing that, it's going to set you up when you do end up in that situation. And then finally, always be on the lookout for good opportunities, because sometimes opportunities come up when we don't expect them. So sometimes someone might reach out to you out of the blue and they're like, I'm starting a new project and I'm looking for someone to help me with some of the technical stuff. And we know as software developers, most of the time, it's like we don't, someone's just kind of trying to get us to do coding work for free. So that's probably not something we want to do, but maybe it is. Maybe it's a great opportunity. And so you have to be well ready to evaluate that. Or maybe your friend is working for a company and they're looking for a new person to, head up some project on their engineering team. Maybe there's a big opportunity for you to advance that if you're too stuck in like, this is the path that I'm following, and you don't leave room to adjust and change course, you're not going to be able to capitalize on. So keeping an ear to the ground, keeping your eyes open for those opportunities is really, really valuable. And so to wrap this all up, I do think that it's important to keep applying for jobs, to keep going through the process now, despite the fact that there are lots of companies that are not hiring. Yes, it can feel really frustrating at times. Yes, there are parts of this process that might be harder than they would be if it was really a job seeker's market. Because it's not right now. It's not a job seeker's market. It's an employer's market. And so things have to change a little bit. You need to focus a little bit more on like, how do I really demonstrate value? How do I really stand out? But the fact of the matter is that if you do that, and if you focus on the right things, you can absolutely still find a job. We have students finding jobs and landing jobs all the time, even with everything going on. So I would encourage you, don't give up, don't get frustrated, keep pushing forward and keep making progress. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and encourage you, if you haven't already, go ahead and check out our free 50 coding interview questions guide. We cover 50 of the most common coding interview questions that you might see in your interview. We've had probably 15 or 20,000 people download that now and get a ton of value out of that. So I'd highly encourage you to check that out. And with that, I look forward to seeing y'all in the next video.